Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are taking on a figure so central to the 20th century that the story of his life is not just parallel to the Soviet Union's existence, but is inseparable from its fiery birth to its dark, bloody betrayal, Leon Trotsky.
And we really need to move beyond that simplified historical narrative,
Yeah.
the one where the Russian Revolution is just a power struggle between Lenin and Stalin.
Right.
Because Lev Davidovich Bronstein, who we all know as Leon Trotsky, was arguably the third, and for a really critical period, the undisputed second most prominent figure in the Soviet state. We're talking about those foundational years between 1917 and Lenin's death in 1924.
So our mission today is to follow that incredible, tragic arc. We're going to look at how a man who was the chief strategist, the architect of the Red Army,
The military genius who won the Civil War.
exactly, how that man could be reduced to the world's most famous political exile, the international symbol of the anti-Stalinist left, and ultimately the target of one of the 20th century's most dramatic assassinations.
We're going to unpack his origins, which are really surprising.
Yeah, and his foundational roles. I mean, from People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs to the man who chaired the Petrograd Soviet. And of course, his intellectual contributions, Trotskyism, and that unyielding, brutal conflict with Joseph Stalin that just consumed his final 2 decades.
It's a tale of a spectacular, almost impossible rise, and then this catastrophic, systematic fall. And we have the source material here to really get into the granular detail to understand not just what happened, but why it happened.
So where do we start?
We'll start with the man at his peak, the political wunderkind, and then we'll track that slow, suffocating process that reduced him from a global revolutionary powerhouse to a stateless figure, hunted across continents by the very apparatus he helped create.
It forces you to ask that essential question, the one that defines all revolutions.
Does bureaucracy inevitably conquer ideology? Or can, a series of political miscalculations doom even the most theoretically sound movement?
Okay, let's unpack this revolutionary origin story because it starts in a place you might not expect for a future radical intellectual who preached global proletarian revolution. It starts with prosperity.
It's a remarkable starting point, isn't it? Leon Trotsky, born Lev Davidovich Bronstein in 1879, came from a surprisingly comfortable Jewish farming family in Yanovka, Ukraine, which was then part of the Russian Empire.
So not exactly from the downtrodden masses.
Not at all. His parents, David and Anna Bronstein, were wealthy grain growers. And what's crucial here is that they were illiterate. They operated completely outside that urban intellectual world.
That's a huge contrast to the background of most other revolutionaries who usually came out of the cities or the impoverished intelligentsia.
Absolutely. So he wasn't exactly destined for the barricades, but the sources all highlight his immense early intellectual horsepower.
Yeah.
That's what clearly separated him from his roots.
From the very beginning.
From the moment he was sent away for school at age 9, he just excelled. He was especially talented in science and mathematics, got praise for his exceptional mind, and he was a famously voracious reader, just absorbing everything he could get his hands on.
His father wanted him to be an engineer, right?
That was the plan. His father intended for him to become a mechanical engineer, and he did briefly study engineering at Odessa University.
But engineering clearly bored him. When did that political fire truly ignite?
It started burning very quickly, around 1896 in Nikolaev. And this is another interesting nuance. He didn't start as a Marxist.
Oh, that's interesting.
He was initially affiliated with the Narodniks. They were these agrarian socialist populists who believed Russia's future lay with the peasant communes.
So what changed his mind?
His future first wife, Ebielta Sokolovskaya. She was a dedicated Marxist, and she was the one who converted him to the materialist doctrines of scientific socialism. By early 1897, he dropped out of his engineering studies completely to go organize the South Russian Workers' Union in Nikolaev.
And organizing meant attracting the inevitable attention of the Tsar's secret police. That led almost immediately to his first major brush with the state.
That's the classic pattern for a professional revolutionary's life, isn't it? In January 1898, he was arrested, along with over 200 other Union members.
Wow.
And he spent the next 2 years just waiting for his trial in a series of prisons, Nikolaev, Kherson, Odessa, and Moscow. These prisons were effectively revolutionary universities for him.
He's meeting other political prisoners, reading.
Exactly. He's reading crucial texts, like Lenin's The Development of Capitalism in Russia. After the trial in 1900, he was sentenced to 4 years of administrative exile in eastern Siberia, where he really solidified his political stance.
And the drama of his escape also marks the birth of that famous name that stuck.
It does. Urged on by Alexandra, who he'd married in a Moscow prison and who later escaped Siberia herself with their two young daughters, Trotsky made his own famous escape in the summer of 1902.
The story is that he was hidden under a load of hay on a cart.
That's the one. He's hidden in the hay. Upon escape, he needed a new passport, so he adopted the name Trotsky, reportedly the name of a stern jailer he'd encountered back in the Odessa prison. That pseudonym stuck for the rest of his life. It became his primary identity.
So he escapes Siberia, makes his way to Western Europe, sails to London, and steps directly into the inner circle of the fragmented Russian Marxist movement.
He arrives in London in October 1902, and he walks, quite literally, into the heart of Russian social democracy. He immediately joins the editorial board of Iskra, which means the spark, working alongside the titans. Georgy Plekhanov, Lenin, Julius Martov.
And he makes a name for himself fast.
Immediately. He quickly became one of the paper's most eloquent and persuasive writers, earning the nickname Perot, which means quill or pen. And the initial reception from Lenin was, well, it was ecstatic.
How impressed was Lenin? We always hear about their later feud, but the sources indicate Lenin saw him as a real diamond in the rough.
Oh, Lenin was deeply impressed, which is what makes the later feud so bitter. He referred to the 23-year-old Trotsky as unquestionably a man of rare abilities, saying he had conviction and energy. He famously predicted Trotsky would go much farther.
That's high praise.
It's more than that. Lenin even proposed co-opting the young man to the editorial board as a full fifth member, a sign of immense political trust and respect, especially given Trotsky's age.
But the seeds of his later tragic downfall were sown almost immediately with that famous 1903 schism at the Second Congress of the RSDLP.
This is the critical moment. This is where personality and ideology just collided. The Congress in London sees the party split into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks.
And the conventional wisdom focuses on the organizational difference, right? Lenin wanting a small, disciplined party, Martov wanting a bigger, more inclusive one.
Right. Lenin wanted the Bolsheviks to be a small, tightly disciplined party of professional revolutionaries, while Martov wanted the Mensheviks to be a larger, more inclusive party that welcomed mere sympathizers. But the source material suggests the philosophical difference underpinning it was actually deeper.
It was about the role of the working class itself.
Exactly. The split was rooted in divergent views on revolutionary consciousness. Lenin believed consciousness had to be brought to the working class by the professional party elite. Martov favored a more spontaneous, organic development of class consciousness within a broader, more open party structure.
And Trotsky initially sided fiercely with the Mensheviks.
He did. He viewed Lenin's concept of a centralized elite party as substitutionism, the idea that the party was substituting itself for the working class. He actually declared himself non-factional by 1904 and spent the next decade trying, unsuccessfully, to reconcile the two warring groups.
And this is where that infamous personal feud with Lenin begins, one that provides endless toxic ammunition for Stalin later on.
It became highly personalized and astonishingly aggressive. During this period, when Trotsky was attacking Lenin's organizational principles, Lenin leveled some truly shocking personal attacks against him in print and private letters.
What kind of attacks?
He called Trotsky Judas, Yudushka, a scoundrel, and even a swine. The intensity of that dispute just colored their entire relationship until they finally reunited in 1917. Trotsky himself later admitted he was wrong to oppose Lenin on the issue of strong, centralized party organization.
Moving on, the next major pivot point is the 1905 revolution. This was his first taste of real executive power, of revolutionary governance.
The massacre on Bloody Sunday in January 1905, where the Tsarist Guard fired on peaceful petitioners in St. Petersburg, it just galvanized revolutionary fervor across the country. Trotsky secretly returned to Russia in February 1905, working with underground groups.
And this was a period of intense ideological development for him.
Absolutely. While he was briefly hiding in rural Finland, he fully articulated his theory of permanent revolution, which was based on the recognition that the Russian bourgeoisie was just too weak to carry out its own revolution.
So when he returned to the capital in October, right in the middle of these massive, widespread strikes, he encountered the Soviet. Explain to us why the St. Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies was so groundbreaking and immediately so powerful.
It was a spontaneous, radical organizational innovation. The Soviet was an elected, non-party mass body that represented the striking workers of the capital. It was initially conceived by the Mensheviks, but Trotsky just rapidly ascended the ranks.
He became the leader.
He joined as deputy, was elected vice chairman, and then after the chairman was arrested, Trotsky took over. This gave him direct executive and symbolic leadership over the revolutionary working class of the Russian capital right at the height of the 1905 uprising.
And his leadership was immediately provocative. He issued a proclamation that directly attacked the economic stability of the Tsarist regime.
The most famous act of the Soviet under his chairmanship was the proclamation about Tsarist government debts. On December 2nd, the Soviet essentially declared the Tsarist government bankrupt.
What did it say?
It said they would not allow the repayment of such loans as had been made by the Tsarist government when openly engaged in a war with the entire people. This wasn't just rhetoric. It was a profound economic challenge. It directly jeopardized the regime's standing with international financiers in Paris and London, and it triggered the final violent crackdown.
Which was swift.
The very next day, December 3rd, 1905, government troops arrested the Soviets' deputies en masse. Trotsky was convicted of sedition and sentenced to indefinite Siberian exile, which led to his dramatic second escape in January 1907.
So, exiled again. He spends the next decade hopping across Europe trying to keep the fractured Marxist movement alive, right up until the outbreak of World War I.
He first moved to Vienna, in Austria-Hungary, in 1907. There, he launched his own bi-weekly Russian-language social democratic paper called Pravda, which means truth. It was popular, non-factional, and successfully smuggled into Russia.
And this detail is crucial because in 1912, the Bolsheviks, under Lenin, deliberately usurped the name.
They did. They launched their own paper, also called Pravda, instantly creating another deep point of friction and resentment with Trotsky that Stalin could and would later weaponize.
The sources also mention his failed attempt to reconcile the factions in 1912.
Yes, the August block of 1912 was his big, comprehensive effort to unify the warring Bolshevik and Menshevik factions. But it was ultimately unsuccessful. He just deeply underestimated Lenin's absolute commitment to organizational separation, and the bloc collapsed quickly.
And then the war breaks out.
When World War I broke out in 1914, he was forced to flee Vienna for neutral Switzerland. The war also split the RSDLP between defeatists like Lenin and Trotsky, who opposed the imperialist war, and defensists like Plekhanov, who supported their nation's war efforts.
His outspoken internationalist anti-war stance made him a dangerous figure for every European government. It ultimately led him all the way to the U.S.
Right. He worked as a war correspondent in France, publishing a paper called Nasze Slovo, Our Word, in Paris. But he was deported in September 1916 for his anti-war activities, first to Spain and then unwillingly to the United States.
He was in the Bronx.
He lived briefly in the Bronx, working for the socialist newspaper Novi Mir. He was there when the February Revolution of 1917 deposed the Tsar, and he left immediately to go back.
And his journey back to Russia provided that famous anecdote, the Canadian detour. The sources describe his month-long detention at the Amherst internment camp in Nova Scotia.
It's an incredible story that just speaks to his relentless, almost manic, charismatic energy. His ship, the SS Christiane of Shore, was intercepted by the Royal Navy. The British detained him as a German-aligned troublemaker.
And what does he do in the camp?
He immediately starts agitating. He's organizing among the workers and sailors who were part of the 800 German inmates. He famously described his month there as one continual mass meeting.
The audacity is remarkable. He's organizing the enemy aliens against their captors?
He was. And the sources say his political speeches were so effective that they sometimes angered the German inmates themselves, many of whom were conservative merchants and officers who hated socialism. They complained to the camp commander about the Russian agitator.
How did he get out?
He was only released after intense diplomatic pressure from the newly formed Petrograd Soviet, which demanded the freedom of a fellow Russian citizen. It was a perfect demonstration of his powerful oratory skills in action.
He finally arrived back in Petrograd in May 1917. The crucial step now was his long-awaited alignment with the Bolsheviks.
Yes. Upon arrival, he joined the Mezryantsy, an organization of non-factional socialists, which formally merged with the Bolsheviks in August 1917. His political influence just exploded.
He's arrested, released.
Right. After the failed July Days uprising, he was briefly arrested, but his release coincided with the failed Kornilov counter-revolutionary uprising. And by October 1917, he was once again elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, which perfectly positioned him to direct the armed uprising that was about to launch the Bolsheviks into power.
And this is where we find the ultimate historical endorsement, confirming his centrality to the revolution's success, an endorsement that naturally was later completely erased by the author himself.
The source material provides a deeply revealing quote from Joseph Stalin, of all people. It was published in Pravda on November 6, 1918, a year after the seizure of power.
What did Stalin say?
He said all practical work in connection with the organization of the uprising was done under the immediate direction of Comrade Trotsky, the president of the Petrograd Soviet. It can be stated with certainty that the party is indebted primarily and principally to Comrade Trotsky for the rapid going over of the garrison to the side of the Soviet and the efficient manner in which the work of the Military Revolutionary Committee was organized.
That is the ultimate acknowledgement. It confirms that he was, at that critical moment, unquestionably the second most powerful and most strategically vital man after Lenin. The fact that passage was quickly expunged from later editions of Stalin's works just underscores the systematic historical rewriting that was about to come.
So the success of the October Revolution launches Trotsky into executive power, and his first role was pure revolutionary provocation on the world stage.
As the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs, his first cabinet post, he literally blew up the established diplomatic world order.
His first critical act was publishing the Triple Entente's secret treaties, including the Sykes-Picot Agreement, on November 23, 1917. These documents revealed the imperialist plans of Britain and France to carve up territories after the war.
Secret agreements that totally contradicted the democratic rhetoric of the Allied powers.
Exactly. This revelation caused immense embarrassment. It destabilized Allied governments, and it achieved a massive, instantaneous propaganda victory for the Bolsheviks. Trotsky famously declared that upon taking the post, he would issue a few revolutionary proclamations to the peoples of the world and then shut up shop.
But his diplomatic career quickly led straight into the biggest immediate crisis facing the newborn Soviet state. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, negotiating peace with the Central Powers, Germany, and Austria-Hungary.
The military situation was desperate. The old Russian army had just dissolved, and the German military was advancing almost unopposed. This created a massive internal policy conflict within the Bolshevik Central Committee. It was a struggle between three distinct positions.
Okay, let's lay out those three positions clearly, because it really defines the early ideological fault lines.
Okay, first you had Lenin. He prioritized survival and immediate peace at almost any cost, recognizing the military impotence of the new state.
Pragmatism above all.
Second, you had the left communists, led by Nikolai Bukharin. They were furious at the thought of peace. They advocated for a revolutionary war, believing the revolution had to be exported immediately and that no peace was possible with capitalist empires. They were willing to sacrifice the Soviet state for the purity of the global revolution.
And then Trotsky carved out his own famous, impossible-to-maintain middle path, the strategy of no war, no peace.
It was strategically brilliant, if ultimately doomed. Trotsky understood that the old army couldn't fight, but he also agreed with the left communists that signing this devastatingly humiliating peace treaty would demoralize the masses.
And revive suspicions of Bolshevik German collusion.
Right, so his proposal was to announce the termination of the war and demobilization of the army without actually signing the treaty. The idea was to put the fate of occupied territories like Poland and the Baltic provinces on the conscience of the German and Austrian working people. He was gambling that Germany was too internally unstable to resume fighting.
It was a gamble he lost, decisively proving Lenin right about the need for immediate, painful peace.
Unfortunately, yes. Germany resumed military operations on February 18, 1918. Their detachments easily routed the disorganized Red Guard forces. And though Trotsky personally abstained from the final Central Committee vote, his policy had failed in spectacular fashion.
So Lenin's position prevailed.
It did. Lenin's position to accept the harsher German terms prevailed by a vote of 7-4. Because Trotsky was so closely associated with no war, no peace, he resigned as Commissar for Foreign Affairs in March 1918, just before the treaty was signed. That probably saved his political career, even if it wounded his pride.
And this diplomatic failure led directly to his greatest historical contribution, building and commanding the Red Army. He became People's Commissar of Army and Navy Affairs and chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council.
This was Trotsky's monumental, career-defining role. The key challenge was that the Civil War, which was about to explode on 16 fronts against organized white armies, Cossacks, and foreign interventionists, it couldn't be won with just revolutionary enthusiasm and elected officers.
The opposition he faced from within his own party was fierce.
Oh, absolutely. The existing Bolshevik military leadership, including the former Defense Commissar Nikolai Podvoisky, vehemently protested his appointment and resigned. They believed the Red Army should only consist of dedicated revolutionaries, rely on propaganda, and have elected officers.
But Trotsky realized those ideals were a recipe for military annihilation. He just shredded them in favor of ruthless efficiency and military necessity.
Precisely. He was facing professional armies. He understood that in that moment, ideology was secondary to organization. The Red Army swelled from under 300,000 in May 1918 to 3 million by mid-1919.
And this expansion relied on controversial draconian methods.
Mass conscription, fierce discipline backed by summary execution for desertion, and mandatory reliance on military specialists, some 50,000 former Tsarist officers.
Using Tsarist officers was pragmatic, but it must have been revolutionary heresy to the hardliners. How did the political commissar system, which sounds like an awkward compromise, actually work to integrate this expertise? Was it just fear, or did it effectively integrate their skills?
It was a fascinating blend of pragmatism and political control. The Tsarist officers were supervised 247 by political commissars who had to co-sign all of their orders. This gave the specialists the necessary technical freedom to command, while the commissars ensured their loyalty to the Soviet cause.
And Trotsky defended this.
He did. He later argued he had no other bricks to build the army, as Lenin later agreed. This system was constantly challenged by Bolshevik hardliners who formed the military opposition in 1918-1919. They viewed it as a total betrayal of revolutionary principle.
He also deployed extremely controversial measures like hostage-taking to prevent defections, measures that, mirror the methods of his future executioner.
The sources confirm this. He authorized holding relatives of ex-Tsarist officials in the Red Army hostage to deter betrayal, particularly on the Eastern Front. While this dark practice was deployed by both Red and White armies, Trotsky later defended it.
What was his justification?
He argued that no families of betraying ex-officials were actually executed, and that such draconian deterrence, if adopted earlier, would have reduced overall Civil War casualties by shortening the conflict. He was operating on a purely utilitarian calculation of maximum efficiency in a total war scenario.
The Civil War period is also inextricably linked with the Red Terror. How did Trotsky, the intellectual, offer a justification for that period of mass repression?
The Red Terror was officially enacted after the assassination of the Petrograd Cheka leader Moisey Uritsky, the party editor V. Volodarsky, and the assassination attempt on Lenin in August 1918. But the Bolsheviks also cited early White Army massacres as context. Trotsky viewed the terror as a necessary historical counter-terror, deployed to defend the revolution's very existence.
And he offered a purely utilitarian, cold-blooded justification for it in his 1920 work, Terrorism and Communism.
He did. He argued that the Red Terror was a necessary weapon deployed against a doomed class that was fighting desperately to survive and does not wish to perish. This wasn't just pragmatic, it was an ideological defense of state violence. He claimed that while the White Terror could only temporarily retard the rise of the proletariat, the Red Terror would hasten the destruction of the bourgeoisie as a class. It really represents the hardening of his political thought under the extreme pressure of the Civil War.
Yet, even as he was winning the war, his internal conflicts, especially with Stalin, were accelerating, foreshadowing the coming succession struggle.
The two clashed fiercely in late 1918 over command appointments on the Southern Front. This was a conflict where Stalin showed his ruthless disregard for military specialists, some of whom he allegedly imprisoned on a barge and then sunk.
And Trotsky won that fight.
Crucially, yes. Trotsky succeeded in reversing Stalin's unauthorized command decisions. A year later, in October 1919, when General Yudenich approached Petrograd, Lenin was prepared to abandon the city to concentrate forces for the defense of Moscow. Trotsky argued passionately and successfully for defending Petrograd, prevailed in the Central Committee, and saved the city, earning the Order of the Red Banner for it.
But his aggressive organizing tendencies led to further clashes in the post-war period regarding the structure of the economy and labor.
With the Civil War winding down in late 1919, attention shifted to the devastated economy. And what's fascinating here is that Trotsky showed surprising economic foresight. In early 1920, he proposed abandoning the harsh war communism policies, specifically grain confiscation and partially restoring the grain market.
A proposal Lenin rejected.
Lenin rejected it, only to adopt those same principles later under the New Economic Policy, or NEP. So on economic reform, Trotsky was actually ahead of the curve.
The Polish-Soviet War in 1920 was another moment of internal friction where his caution was overruled.
Yes. Lenin and others believed the Red Army's successes meant they could export the revolution into Europe. They overruled Trotsky's call for a quick peace, believing they had a revolutionary obligation to launch an offensive to carry the revolution to Poland and beyond.
which ended in disaster.
The subsequent devastating defeat at the Battle of Warsaw was a massive blow, forcing them to sign a painful peace treaty again, confirming Trotsky's earlier strategic caution.
The last great debate before Lenin's final illness was the trade union debate, and this highlights his most controversial authoritarian tendencies regarding labor organization.
It does. Trotsky advocated the militarization of labor. He argued that trade unions should be integrated directly into the state apparatus, treating workers essentially as soldiers of labor under strict discipline to rebuild the economy.
A deeply unpopular policy.
Very. And Lenin sharply disagreed. He argued unions should retain some independence as schools of communism, teaching workers state administration and self-governance. Lenin's view won at the 10th Party Congress in 1921.
And finally, his instrumental role in suppressing the Kronstadt Rebellion, an act that defined his role as both savior and destroyer of democratic ideals.
The Kronstadt Rebellion in March 1921 saw sailors and soldiers at the naval base revolt. They demanded democratic reforms, free elections to the Soviets, and an end to one-party rule. As Commissar of War, Trotsky was instrumental in ordering the successful violent suppression of the rebellion by the Red Army,
resulting in thousands of deaths and executions.
Yes, this is a direct, brutal confrontation between the party and those who upheld the revolution's early ideals. Anarchists like Emma Goldman accused him of betraying the revolution's democratic promise.
This incredible duality really defines his time in power, making him such a complex historical figure. The historian Vladimir Cherniev summarizes this dark contradiction in a very sobering critique.
Cherniev states that Trotsky bears a great deal of responsibility both for the victory of the Red Army in the Civil War and for the establishment of a one-party authoritarian state with its apparatus for ruthlessly suppressing dissent. This includes being an ideologist and practitioner of the Red Terror, the initiator of forced labor camps, and promoting summary executions.
Practices that later became the standard monstrous operating procedure under Stalin. He created the very machinery that would later hunt and destroy him.
Exactly. Yet the sources also stress that without Trotsky's unique ability to blend revolutionary zeal with the pragmatic use of military specialists and his capacity for swift, determined action, the Bolsheviks would almost certainly have lost the Civil War within a year. It's impossible to discuss his contributions without acknowledging that fatal contradiction. By late 1921, Trotsky stood at the peak of his career. He was number 2 in the government, a founding Politburo member, and the hero who saved the revolution. But the political ground was already shifting, primarily because of Lenin's failing health, which began this dangerous vacuum of power.
Lenin suffered his first stroke in May 1922, and his health just slowly declined until his death in January 1924. This deterioration created a political vacuum that was filled not by revolutionary merit, but by administrative maneuvering and conspiracy.
That's the critical dynamic. Joseph Stalin, who had just been elevated to the brand new administrative position of Central Committee General Secretary in April 1922, a position nobody yet understood to be the fulcrum of power, immediately formed a triumvirate.
The Troika.
The Troika,
Yeah.
with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. And their explicit, singular mission was to prevent Trotsky, who was widely considered Lenin's heir presumptive, from succeeding him.
Why was the Troika so fixated on stopping Trotsky? Was it purely ideological, or was there deep-seated resentment?
It was a mixture of both. Trotsky was immensely popular with the younger generation and the Red Army, but he was disliked by many old Bolsheviks for his abrasive personality, his perceived arrogance, and his constant non-factional maneuvering before 1917.
And the Troika exploited that resentment.
They did. They used the Secretariat to cut Trotsky off from decision-making, deliberately withholding information and scheduling Politburo meetings when he was ill or away.
But Lenin tried to intervene. He foresaw the catastrophic danger posed by this rising bureaucracy centered around Stalin's Secretariat.
That is the pivotal missed opportunity in Soviet history. In late 1922, Lenin began to ally strategically with Trotsky against Stalin over crucial issues, like preserving the foreign trade monopoly and opposing Stalin's brutal handling of the Georgian affair.
Lenin actually wrote to Stalin about it.
He did. He wrote to Stalin stating he had come to an arrangement with Trotsky to stand up for my views on the trade monopoly, confirming that he trusted Trotsky over the rest of the leadership on key policy matters.
And Lenin also explicitly offered Trotsky the position that might have secured his future, but Trotsky refused it. This gets right to the core of his political flaw.
Yes. On September 11, 1922, Lenin proposed that Trotsky should become his deputy at the Council of People's Commissars, the Sovnarkom. Many historians interpret this as Lenin subtly designating Trotsky his successor as head of government, but Trotsky categorically refused.
If Lenin had laid the political path for him, why did Trotsky, the great strategist, fail to execute these basic political steps? Was he too much the theorist to be a successful politician?
The sources offer multiple possible reasons, all of which point to a lack of political acumen in the context of bureaucratic infighting. One interpretation, based on the notes of Politburo Secretary Boris Bozanov, suggests Trotsky declined because he feared his Jewish origins would be exploited to fuel anti-Semitic attitudes towards the Soviet Union.
Damaging the state during a sensitive transition.
Right. Others argue it was intellectual arrogance. He simply disdained the mundane administrative work of running the state, preferring to focus on intellectual debates and military strategy. Whatever the specific motivation, the historian Mark Macaulay noted it was a lamentable lack of political judgment at the crucial moment.
Then came the famous testament, which the Troika successfully suppressed after Lenin's death in January 1924.
In January 1923, days before his final stroke, Lenin dictated an amendment to his testament. It recommended Stalin's removal as general secretary due to his rudeness and excessive power, while also mildly criticizing Trotsky for excessive self-assurance.
And Lenin asked Trotsky to act.
He asked Trotsky to denounce Stalin's Great Russian nationalistic campaign at the upcoming 12th Party Congress.
So why did Trotsky, armed with Lenin's direct support and the potentially explosive testament, remain silent at the 12th Party Congress?
This is perhaps his greatest tactical failure. At the Congress in April 1923, Trotsky did not raise the issue of the testament or directly confront the Troika. He later claimed he refused to deliver a report because it seemed to me equivalent to announcing my candidacy for the role of Lenin's successor at a time when Lenin was fighting a grave illness, which he viewed as inappropriate.
This extreme political caution, or perhaps his characteristic intellectual disdain for petty factional fighting, allowed the Troika to win.
It did. They controlled the Congress delegates, adopted vague resolutions on democracy that were never implemented, and effectively sealed their control over the party apparatus.
After Lenin's death in January 1924 and the Troika's successful suppression of the testament, Trotsky finally launched his formal offensive, creating the left opposition.
His offensive began in mid-1923, sparked by widespread economic strikes. In October 1923, Trotsky wrote a sharp letter to the Central Committee, followed by the broader Declaration of 46. These documents condemned the rise of the secretarial hierarchy and the total loss of internal party democracy.
A critique that was politically prophetic.
Absolutely. But the apparatus, controlled by Stalin's secretariat, immediately fought back, not on policy, but by inventing the label Trotskyism.
They manufactured Trotskyism, weaponizing it to mean petty bourgeois deviation.
And in October 1924, Trotsky gave them fresh ammunition by publishing Lessons of October, an article summarizing the 1917 revolution. Crucially, this piece publicly attacked Zinoviev and Kamenev for their 1917 hesitation to seize power.
This ignited the literary discussion.
It did. The Troika countered by resurrecting all of Trotsky's pre-1917 disagreements with Lenin, painting him as a perpetual outsider and a disloyal Bolshevik.
The political damage was immediate and devastating, resulting in his total political castration.
The Troika used the debate to marginalize him completely. Although Stalin played the moderate by preventing his expulsion, Trotsky was forced to resign his crucial military posts as People's Commissar of Army and Fleet Affairs and Chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council in January 1925.
His control over the military, his strongest institutional base, was gone.
And the political landscape shifted again as that alliance of convenience fractured. The Troika only lasted as long as Trotsky was the common enemy. Once he was defanged, Stalin turned on Zinoviev and Kamenev, defeating them.
They were dubbed the new opposition.
Right, and realizing their fatal error, they soon gravitated back toward Trotsky's followers, forming the United Opposition in early 1926.
So the fight was no longer just about bureaucracy. It was now centered on the absolute ideological conflict that would define the global left for decades. Permanent revolution versus socialism in one country.
This was the defining, irreconcilable clash. Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution held that for the revolution to survive in a backward country like Russia, it must spread internationally to advanced capitalist countries for support.
And Stalin's theory rejected that.
Completely. Stalin's emerging theory of socialism in one country argued that the USSR could achieve true socialism independently, focusing inward on consolidation. This was enormously appealing to the Soviet bureaucracy, who just wanted stability and national power.
The true tragic test of these opposing strategies played out in China?
The Chinese Revolution became the ideological demarcation line, and the sources show how clear the warnings were. Trotsky argued that the small Chinese Communist Party must maintain class independence from the Kuomintang, the KMT.
But Stalin insisted they merge.
He insisted they merge and submit to the KMT leadership, believing the KMT leader Chiang Kai-shek was the only one capable of defeating the imperialists. Stalin infamously insisted they should use Chiang's right-wing KMT until they were squeezed for all usefulness like a lemon before being discarded.
But the lemon squeezed back first, proving Trotsky completely and tragically right.
In April 1927, Chiang Kai-shek reversed the tables in the Shanghai Massacre, brutally massacring the communists, killing thousands. This ideological disaster deeply discredited Stalin's foreign policy. But by then, Stalin was so entrenched, controlling the entire party apparatus, that he could just crush the internal opposition anyway, ignoring the validation of Trotsky's warnings.
The final nail in the political coffin was the opposition's ill-fated attempt to take their arguments out of the party committee rooms and onto the streets.
On the 10th anniversary of the October Revolution, in November 1927, the opposition held a street demonstration in Moscow against Stalin's government. This public challenge was instantly dispersed and condemned as factionalism.
And he was expelled from the party.
Shortly after, he gave his last public speech in the Soviet Union at his friend Adolf Joff's funeral later that month, after Joff committed suicide in protest.
His exile started internally before moving abroad.
He was exiled to Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan, in January 1928 with his wife and eldest son, Lev. From this internal exile, he continued to write and organize. A year later, the decision was made to deport him entirely from the Soviet Union to Turkey in February 1929.
We have to pause here to acknowledge the horrifying long-term cost of this struggle, particularly the fate of his family and the purges that followed. Stalin's cruelty wasn't limited to politics. It extended to biological annihilation.
The tragedy is profound, and the sources emphasize this systematic, targeted cruelty. Almost all of the 18 close relatives Trotsky left behind in the Soviet Union faced repression. His children and other relatives were subjected to torture and execution in the purges.
Can you tell us more about the fate of his sons, Lev and Sergei?
His eldest son, Lev Sedov, was a committed revolutionary and a key political activist. He died under mysterious circumstances in Paris in 1938, almost certainly assassinated by NKVD agents. His younger son, Sergei Sedov, was a scientist, an engineer, and he explicitly rejected political life.
But even his non-political status offered no protection.
Not at all. Sergei was arrested in 1937 and executed, as was Trotsky's sister, Olga Kameneva. This wasn't random violence. It was a targeted, systematic campaign to erase not just his ideas, but his entire biological existence and any vestige of a shared personal past within the Soviet state. It just underscores the utter ruthlessness of Stalin's betrayal.
So, Trotsky is deported to Turkey in 1929, now a stateless global pariah, spending the last decade of his life physically escaping Stalin while intellectually dismantling him from exile.
His first refuge was Buyukada, or Prinkipo, an island near Istanbul. He lived in the Yanarose mansion, heavily guarded and under surveillance, but safe from immediate execution. This was an incredibly productive period for him.
This is where he wrote his major works.
It was. He wrote prolifically, including his monumental history of the Russian Revolution and his autobiography. Critically, in 1932, he and his family officially lost their Soviet citizenship. He was completely stateless, entirely dependent on the political goodwill of foreign powers.
And that statelessness led to 4 years of precarious European asylum, with every government eager to get rid of him due to relentless political pressure from both local fascists and the Soviet regime.
Every asylum granted was conditional and brief. In 1933, he found temporary asylum in France, but was restricted from living in Paris and placed under constant police surveillance. His situation became absolutely untenable after the Franco-Soviet Treaty of Mutual Assistance in 1935. He was officially told he was no longer welcome as the French sought to appease Stalin.
And the next stop, Norway, proved to be one of the most cynically frustrating experiences of his entire life.
In 1935, he was granted asylum in Norway, becoming a guest of Konrad Knudsen near Hønefoss. But when the infamous Moscow show trials began in the summer of 1936, accusing him of these massive, complex conspiracies, the Norwegian Labour government grew terrified of Soviet pressure.
They cracked down on him.
Following a fascist burglary on his house, police forced Trotsky to sign new conditions. No writing on current politics, no interviews, all correspondence inspected.
It's incredible to think the man who directed the Civil War was effectively imprisoned by a supposedly socialist government just because Moscow snapped its fingers. What did the sources say about the psychological impact of that forced silence?
He was under effective house arrest, confined indoors 22 hours a day, desperately prevented from protesting the trials where his former comrades Zinoviev and Kamenev were confessing to plotting with him to kill Stalin. He later called this period of enforced silence and political persecution by the Norwegian socialist government the worst persecution he had ever experienced.
Worse than his Siberian exiles.
Worse than Siberia. By late 1936, the Norwegian government deported him again, and he arrived in Mexico in January 1937, welcomed by President Lázaro Cárdenas.
Mexico gave him a crucial period of intellectual safety and a famously colorful social life with the revolutionary art community.
He and Natalia first lived at La Casa Azul, the home of painters Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, where Trotsky also had a brief, notorious affair with Kahlo. He later broke with Rivera over political disagreements and moved to his final fortified residence on Avenida Vienna in Coyoacán.
And he collaborated with other artists there.
He famously collaborated with André Breton and Rivera on the Manifesto for an Independent Revolutionary Art in 1938, advocating fiercely for artistic freedom outside of both capitalist and Stalinist constraints.
But the Moscow show trials were raging, inventing these elaborate conspiracies against him. How did he fight back from exile against the enormous propaganda machine of the Soviet state?
The trials saw old Bolsheviks confess to plotting to kill Stalin with Trotsky. He was sentenced to death in absentia. To combat this fabrication, he cooperated with an independent commission of inquiry chaired by the famous American philosopher John Dewey.
The Dewey Commission?
Yes. The Dewey Commission rigorously investigated the charges, traveled to Mexico, and published its findings in the book Not Guilty, completely exonerating Trotsky and exposing the trials as fabrications extracted by torture.
That international independent validation must have been critical for the anti-Stalinist movement. I appreciate the sources highlighting his defiant opening statement to the commission.
He delivered a defiant address titled, "I Stake My Life," reaffirming his lifelong commitment to true socialism. Whoever seeks physical comfort and spiritual calm, let him step aside. But all those for whom the word socialism is not a hollow sound, forward. That conviction, in the face of immense danger, is key to his legacy.
And this conviction led directly to his final great organizational effort, the founding of the Fourth International.
By mid-1933, after the Nazis seized power in Germany, Trotsky judged the Communist International, the Comintern, to be dead. It had failed utterly to rally the German working class against Hitler, and had just become a tool of Stalin's foreign policy. So in 1938, he decided to found the Fourth International as a revolutionary internationalist alternative.
This move cemented his ideological legacy.
It did, but it also underscored his relentless, uncompromising commitment to factional organization, even utter isolation.
Just months before his death, under the shadow of persistent threats, he left us his final, incredibly moving political and personal statement.
His testament, written in February 1940 because he feared a cerebral hemorrhage due to high blood pressure, is profoundly human. It reaffirmed his unshaken faith in a communist future, forcefully denied Stalin's accusations of betrayal, and thanked his wife, Natalia Sedova, describing her as an inexhaustible source of love, magnanimity, and tenderness.
And his final words were about life itself.
His final poignant words stated, "Life is beautiful. Let the future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression, and violence, and enjoy it to the full."
The attempts on his life started almost immediately after that, culminating in one of the most infamous murders in history.
There was a brazen failed attempt in May 1940, led by NKVD agents, including the muralist David Alfaro Siqueiros. They sprayed his house with machine gun fire. Trotsky survived, though his 14-year-old grandson was shot in the foot. He recognized the gravity and wrote, "Stalin seeks my death," knowing the attempt would be repeated.
And the successful attack in August 1940 is famous, but the weapon is frequently misidentified.
On August 20th, 1940, NKVD agent Ramon Mercader, having infiltrated Trotsky's household under the guise of being a friendly Belgian journalist, attacked him in his study. The sources are precise. Mercader used a mountaineering ice axe, a specialized tool used for cutting steps and holds on ice, not the commonly cited ice pick.
So it was an ice axe, not an ice pick.
Correct. The flat, wide adze of the axe struck his head, fracturing his parietal bone and penetrating 7 centimeters into his brain.
It's chilling that even after such a catastrophic injury, he fought back and insisted on his killer being kept alive.
Witnesses reported Trotsky spat on Mercader, struggled fiercely, and even broke Mercator's hand during the attack. Even in agony, he insisted his bodyguards not kill the assassin, but keep him alive so he could answer questions and expose the plot.
He died the next day.
He died the next day at age 60 from blood loss and shock. Mercator spent 20 years in a Mexican prison.
And the absolute confirmation of Stalin's direct responsibility came decades later.
Yes, Mercator was initially denied any public award by the USSR, but upon his release and arrival in the Soviet Union in 1961, Leonid Brezhnev personally signed a decree awarding Mercator the title Hero of the Soviet Union for the special deed, confirming that the Kremlin orchestrated the assassination and celebrated it as a state victory.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's shift to the intellectual legacy he left behind, which continues to influence the left today. What are the key takeaways for you, the learner, from this deep dive into his theoretical contributions?
First and foremost is the concept of permanent revolution. We discussed it conceptually, but the takeaway is clear. In countries with underdeveloped capitalism, the working class must seize power, rapidly implement socialist measures, and critically link their struggle to the international revolution. The revolution cannot be completed or sustained nationally. It must spread, or it will succumb to internal and external pressures.
This was the fundamental rebuttal to Stalin's nationalized, insular concept of socialism.
Exactly. Second is his definitive and increasingly prescient critique of the Soviet system, articulated in his most important book.
The Revolution Betrayed.
Right. In that book, from 1936, he offered a devastating assessment of the USSR. He argued that the Soviet Union had become a degenerated worker state, dominated by an undemocratic, parasitical bureaucracy that betrayed the revolution's promise of workers' democracy.
And he predicted its collapse.
He predicted that this bureaucratic state would either be overthrown by a political revolution establishing workers' democracy, or, absent that, degenerate into a capitalist class state, a view many scholars found astonishingly prescient of the USSR's eventual collapse after 1989.
His economic thinking, despite his loss of power, was also highly influential, even on Stalin's policy decisions.
Trotsky was an early and consistent advocate for strong economic planning and accelerated industrialization as early as 1923. He proposed joint reports to the Central Committee to strengthen Gosplan and introduce a national plan to catch up to the West.
But his approach was different from Stalin's.
Very different. His later proposals countered Stalin's brutal forced collectivization by emphasizing that successful planning required Soviet democracy, the right of criticism, free elections, internal party democracy, which he insisted would yield higher economic successes than the bureaucratic, terror-driven approach. It is now scholarly consensus that Stalin basically appropriated the left opposition's position on accelerated industrialization, even if he implemented it with characteristic brutality.
And finally, his strategic view on countering fascism proved heartbreakingly correct in the 1930s.
His strategy was the united front. Revolutionaries and reformists must temporarily unite in a common struggle to mobilize workers against fascism. He strongly criticized the Comintern's shifting policy under Stalin, which forced German communists to treat the Social Democrats as social fascists.
Which divided the German working class.
It did. And the failure of the Comintern to forge a united front in Germany is widely judged to have tragically facilitated Hitler's rise to power, a devastating historical validation of Trotsky's warnings. Looking back, Trotsky is a study in historical duality. He was the revolutionary hero, the unparalleled orator and writer, the general who forged the Red Army and won the Civil War, and yet simultaneously he was the intellectual who articulated the most comprehensive critique of Stalinism and the anti-Stalinist last entire program.
He was literally written out of history by Stalin's machine, becoming a non-person whose name could not be spoken.
He was completely erased under Stalin. His works were banned in the USSR until 1987 under Gorbachev's glasnost. It wasn't until 2001 that the General Prosecutor's Office of the Russian Federation officially rehabilitated him.
That historical erasure was a deliberate campaign.
Oh, it was a deliberate attempt by Stalin to remove his legacy, which required the virtually unlimited resources of the Soviet regime and the ruthless extermination of every single person associated with his name.
But the physical traces of his life endures globally, a testament to his intellectual struggle.
His archive, which he sold just before his assassination, is now housed at Harvard University. It occupies 65 feet of shelf space, a gold mine for historians. And his preserved final home in Coyoacan, Mexico City, where he died, remains the Leon Trotsky House Museum, a stark, moving monument to his final, defiant years.
So what does this all mean for us? We've seen a man with undeniable brilliance, a military genius, and an intellectual powerhouse who failed spectacularly at the simple political maneuvering required to succeed Lenin. The sources repeatedly hint at a critical flaw.
The historical reputation is split. There's immense praise for his organizational skills and intellectual foresight, mixed with strong criticism for his early authoritarian practices that paved the way for Stalin's terror. But the fundamental tragedy lies in the political arena. He was a brilliant theorist who seemed blind to the machinery of political power once the revolution became institutionalized.
So here is a final provocative thought for you to explore, based on the material we've covered today. If Trotsky's personal refusal to accept the deputy premier role in 1922 and his subsequent hesitation to directly challenge Stalin, armed with Lenin's testament, at the 12th Congress in 1923 ultimately enabled Stalin's ascent, to what extent can an individual's personality flaws, such as intellectual arrogance or a fatal misreading of the changing political climate doom even the most theoretically sound political movement?
Is the greatest visionary often the worst politician?
Think about that as you reflect on this deep dive into the life and fate of Leon Trotsky. We hope you feel a little better informed.